Hello, welcome to the Stormwater Utility Forum. My name is Micah Shapiro. I'm the co-chair of the Jersey Waterworks Stormwater Utility Subcommittee. We're very excited to have you guys join us today for this session. Next slide, please. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce the host organization. Jersey Waterworks is a collaborative effort of many diverse organizations and individuals with the goal of transforming water infrastructure through effective and financially sustainable water systems, empowering stakeholders, successful and beneficial green infrastructure, and smart combined sewer overflow control plans. And the goal of our subcommittee is to provide educational resources regarding sustainable, dedicated, and equitable stormwater funding opportunities. We created this forum so that we can bring stormwater utility experts to you and to serve as a resource to the community. Next slide, please. For each town hall style session, we'll be hearing from our experts who will give a short 15 to 20-minute presentation, followed by an active Q&A discussion. These sessions were designed to educate New Jersey utility leaders, government stormwater managers, municipal and county representatives, and elected officials. Before we get started, a few ground rules and logistics. We will be recording only the presentation components of this session. These will be posted on Jersey Waterworks website for reference. We've opted not to record the Q&A session so that folks can feel comfortable asking questions and discussing topics openly. We ask that you respect each other and keep the conversations in the discussion portion confidential to these sessions, and feel free to post your questions in the chat as they come up. However, please do understand that we will not be answering questions until the presentation has finished. Now, I would like to introduce our experts presenting today. We have Prabha Kumar of Black and Beach and Elizabeth Treadway of WSP. They're both key organizers of this forum. I'd also like to acknowledge a few other folks that were instrumental in planning this forum. We have Patricia Dunkett of New Jersey Future. She's our subcommittee's backbone staff member, and my co-chair of this subcommittee, Dana Patterson of Princeton Hydro. These are today's session, as well as two more following sessions for you to add to your calendars. Next slide. And take it away, Prabha.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So today we are going to continue our conversation that we've had after the first two sessions. I'm going to really quickly do a recap on what we discussed in the last session. I know some of you may not have been in the last session, and then we'll really focus today's session on policies. So I'll be doing the kind of the presentation, walking you through what we have, and then during Q&A time, our colleague Elizabeth Treadway will also kind of join to help kind of respond to any questions you may have. Okay. So in the last session, we really talked about the financial planning process, which is the foundation for any kind of funding analysis and really for program resilience. And especially in the context of what we are talking, establishing any kind of a new user fee program. So we explained last time that typically when we talk about a program, especially in the context of financial planning, what we need to really look at is what exactly are your current program current activities that you're really doing, both in the case of operations and maintenance program for stormwater activities and capital program, but also what do you think are your future needs in terms of where you are and where you want to go in terms of level of service that you need to provide, including all the compliance obligations that utilities have to fulfill. We also talked about then the importance of defining the capital program based on whatever information you have, starting somewhere, defining the capital program, but not just defining the capital program, but while doing that evaluation, also evaluating, are there any sources of funding that you've already identified that you can leverage, whether it may be loans, whether it may be grants, whether it may be any kind of a partnership contribution, evaluating the financing and what type of program you don't even have any funding even planned. So looking at all of that due diligence. Those are all for really ongoing and recurring program for the O&M and capital. In addition to that, when we are talking about financial planning comprehensively, you also have to look at any one-time program implementation costs. You may have not done certain things at a certain level that you want, so you may want to do a temporary one-time ramp-up of certain activities, O&M activities, or you may want to do some critical projects that you've really deferred. So you have to also look at those kind of one-time implementation costs and activities. And when we talk implementation here, we are also talking if you are going to implement a new stormwater user fee program in your utility, then there are one-time implementation costs associated with that. That also has to be included in the revenue requirements analysis. So using item 1, 2, and 3, then you develop a comprehensive 5-year revenue requirement forecast is what we talked about last time. And also looking at any alternative potential sources of funding. Some utilities may decide, I want to bring certain amount of money from the general fund, at least to begin with, or they may have other sources of funding, like even basic things like inspection fees and other kinds of sources. You have to really look at all of that comprehensively and then develop a 5-year financial plan. And what we said when you go through the due diligence process is you will be able to diagnose the funding gap that you really have. Where are you right now? Where do you want to go? And then more important, it'll also tell you, okay, over the next 5 years, based on what we have defined, what is the annual revenue requirements, specifically revenue requirements that you need to cover from a new user fee program. So it'll give a lens into both. So that's what we said. And that then helps you to go down the decision path of how much money you think you may be able to get from other sources, how much money do you really need to recover from a new dedicated stormwater user fee program. So that's really what we covered in the last meeting. So then the next step is, okay, so what does this give you? This gives you the numerator of the equation, the revenue requirements, and which you will then use to define the rate structure, which we're going to talk in the next session. But in this session, we're going to talk about, okay, before you go from revenue requirements and translating that into a rates and rate structure, there are several aspects that you have to consider, due diligence that has to be done. And that is what we are kind of using the term policies. It's just a broad umbrella term that we are using, policies. Basically, it is issues that you need to consider and have some decisions on each of those key issues. So today we are going to give you a lens into what those are. Before we go into talking about what those issues are, what those policies that you have to consider, the fundamental question is why? Why do we have to do that? Why do we have to worry about issues and policies? It's really because when you talk about policies, it's really a set of considerations that you have to evaluate because those factors influence organizational, financial, technical, and implementation aspects of this whole journey of establishing a dedicated user fee program. Why is it important? Why do we have to look at these kinds of policy issues up front in a feasibility study? Really because these policy deliberations and the decisions that you will have internally in your utility for these issues you're going to touch on, that's what is going to provide defensible guidelines and really kind of a roadmap for really making sure that what the program, any utility development, any program you're going to develop can have a sound footing, both from a technical standpoint, also from a defensibility legal standpoint. Okay. Next slide. Okay, so what are we going to touch on in the short time we have? This in itself can be a very extensive seminar, but we are going to just give you a flavor of what kind of issues that typically utilities need to be aware, especially those who are engaging in this feasibility study aspect. First question, really, utilities, many times we hear the first question is organizational. Do I have to change my organization quite a bit? What do I need to do if I don't have a dedicated funding? So we'll touch on the organizational positioning and any changes that you may or may not need. The second question that always comes up is struggling with what cost do I include? What cost do I exclude? If I don't include a cost now, is that a challenge that I can't include it later? So we'll just touch on those. Then we talk about what should my fee even be based on? When we talk about a dedicated fee, what should I base it on? What is an industry best practice? So we'll touch on that. Then all of that then leads into rate structure. So when we talk about rate structure, what do we really mean? What kind of decisions or alternatives that we need to evaluate? Now, we will go into a little more on the rate structure itself with examples in the next meeting, but this will already get you thinking about what do we mean by rate structure and the alternatives. And then how are we going to build this? That is not an afterthought. That is something that also has to be addressed during the feasibility study. Well, how are we going to build this? What kind of system are we going to use? What are the implications? So these are the broad areas we're going to touch on today. Again, everything we're going to touch on at a higher level because we don't have kind of the time to go deeper dive into everything. That typically you will do during the study that you actually do. Next slide. So when we talk about organization, this question always comes up. Every utility is managing stormwater right now in whatever level of maturity or whatever level of sophistication. You're all managing stormwater in some form or fashion at some level. So the question then becomes now under the New Jersey legislation where they have authorized municipalities and commissions that you could establish a stormwater user fee program, does it mean you really have to, when we use the term utility, does it mean do you have to have a new department? Or do I have to have a separate utility or do I have to have a separate authority? Do I need to reorganize? Do I have to consolidate some things? So these are all the questions that comes up. First of all, the first answer is no, you don't have to form a new department. Sometimes when we go and work with a client, right now I'm working with a client where the stormwater activities are spread across 5 departments. Do they have to consolidate to establish a user fee program? No. They may continue to do the way they are doing for now, as long as there is clarity as to who's doing what in the department. So that the idea is that you're not doing redundant work within your organization. Each department may be doing a certain type of activity and that is fine. And later, when you establish the dedicated funding, you could still consider whether you want to do some consolidations or some reorganizations. You don't have to have a separate utility formed just because you're going to have a stormwater dedicated program. And as in New Jersey, we find, and as in many other places, stormwater activity sometimes is already under a utility, like a water sewer utility may be doing actually all the stormwater activities. Example would be Newark, New Jersey. All the stormwater activities are being performed under the water sewer utility. That's how they are organized. In another place we go, it may be done not necessarily by the utility, but it may be done by Public Works Department that does not do water and sewer activities. So that is also quite acceptable. So that might be that organization's governance structure. So again, the key is to understand who's doing what. Key is to have clarity on clearly the delineation of responsibilities, and then you may decide as part of this effort to do some reorganization if you want to do it, or you could even say, you know what, at this point we're not going to do any reorganization. We are going to capture all the costs. That's the key point. We're going to capture all the costs regardless of who's doing what, and then decide which of those costs you're going to bring into a stormwater user fee funding program. So that's how we want to approach the organization. So this in itself should not become a barrier for starting this effort of a stormwater user fee funding exploration. Second, resources. The constant thing we hear is that, we don't have the resources. And one of the reasons you don't have the resources is you don't have funding. So it's kind of a catch-22, right? So again, you can look at the technology systems that you currently have. You can look at the staffing resources and skill sets that you have. And that's when you may have to start evaluating what do we have? Where are the gaps in our resource capacity? What are the gaps in our skill sets? And how do we fulfill those gaps, especially if you want to increase the level of service that we are currently providing? And that's where you may have to start making some decisions about, do we acquire some staff in a gradual way over 1 or 2 or 3 years? Or there are certain activities, like if it is really a lot of inlet cleaning and catch basin cleaning, that kind of stuff that you really want to ramp up, you could do that through contract services, right? So you could always have that option of acquiring more contract services than what you may be currently doing, provided you then consider that, plan for it, and put that into your revenue requirement that you're going to ramp up your contract services activities. So that's what we really mean by resources, really taking a look at this, because as you can see, the decisions that you make here directly are tied to the program level of service you want to provide and the cost of the program that you have to plan for. Next slide. So those are the organization thing that kind of segues into program cost. So again, last time we kind of talked about program cost, but really some of the things, and Elizabeth walked through a chart with a lot of various activities under various categories, and the categories she presented was program administration, water quality, really for all the MS4 compliance, engineering and planning, drainage, literally drainage system operations and maintenance, regulatory compliance activities. When you take all these buckets, yes, all these are very fundamental buckets when you're talking about stormwater management. So those things you have to kind of look at, okay, who is doing what and which costs we want to bring into the for the recovery of the stormwater user fee program. The more comprehensive you are, the better lens you are going to get into what is my total stormwater cost. If you leave out one or two just because some other department is doing that, let's say a transportation department is actually doing for some reason the drainage operations maintenance, but if you ignore it, then you're not going to get a sense of what is my total cost of stormwater management. That's why we always encourage that bring a holistic view when you're developing the program cost and also the level of service. Really, that is on the O&M side. When you look at the capital side, then you have the same kind of questions you have to ask. What are the critical capital program needs? What kind of routine repair and rehabilitation are we currently doing to manage the integrity of our infrastructure? Are we doing anything proactive, or are we completely doing everything reactive? And can we, if you're doing everything reactive because we didn't have funding, can we start slowly thinking about transitioning to more of a proactive approach? So there is some level of reactive, but there is also some level of proactive approach. That is for routine repair and maintenance. One of the constant questions that comes is, what do I do? Do I really focus on small stormwater projects that really helps us mitigate some localized flooding? Or should I worry about very large climate change resilience kind of projects? It really depends on where you are, where you're starting. Now, in some cases where if you have some level of good funding and you really want to build on to more resiliency kind of projects, you really can. You could start looking at some resiliency park, like Hoboken has certain resiliency park projects that we were considering bringing it into the stormwater utility structure. So those are, again, decisions that you have to look at your environment. And then it's not only about just the existing infrastructure you have and resilience project, but also keeping in mind what are the other community problems, specifically because of infrastructure the community is facing, and thinking about what level of projects we may have to bring in. Again, with the idea that you don't have to get overwhelmed thinking, how am I going to do all of these things? Start, and it's always thinking that, yeah, this program can evolve. So start with something meaningful, some baseline, and then you can always evolve this program as funding begins to get established. So what are the key decisions here that from a policy standpoint, what decisions do you have to make? Can you click on this slide? Yeah. So the key policy decisions are, number one question that always comes up: street sweeping. Should I include it in the stormwater cost recovery? There is no right or wrong answer for this, depending on, first of all, who's responsible for street sweeping. And street sweeping has stormwater management benefits, but street sweeping is not done only because of stormwater. Street sweeping is also important for basic public health and safety and all of that, right? So it's an internal decision as to whether you want to include either all, some, or part of street sweeping annual cost into the stormwater cost recovery mechanism. For example, Philadelphia Water Department, the water department is not responsible for street sweeping activities. It's done generally under the public works of the city of Philadelphia. And so street sweeping costs, they made a conscious decision not to include street sweeping costs in the stormwater cost recovery that Philadelphia Water Department does. So these are some decisions, important kind of decisions that you'll have to make. So you're going to find there are some entities where street sweeping costs are included. There are some that include part of it. Some decide not to include it. And some may decide in the beginning, I'm not going to include it, but subsequently over the period of time, I may bring part of the street sweeping costs into stormwater management program. Snow removal. Snow removal is even more tricky. Yeah, snow removal, the snow really causes wet weather, of course. It causes runoff. So there again, there's a decision to be made. But again, snow removal is not only for wet stormwater management purposes. Snow removal is also important for public safety, transit, transportation, all of that. So there again, that kind of a decision has to be made as to whether we want to include it, or in the beginning, maybe we may not consider including it. Or it can be decided that street sweeping and snow removal will continue to stay under the general fund cost recovery approach. Another important question is the pace of O&M ramp up. Wherever you go, nobody has all the O&M that they desire. In very many places, O&M is getting deferred and they're really trying to catch up. So then the question is, when you have to ramp up, that's where you have to be realistic, pragmatic. Can I ramp up very quickly, if you want to ramp up a lot of the O&M fairly quickly, so you have a robust operations and maintenance program, then you may have to see whether you'll be able to ramp up the capital program, because you can do everything all at one time. So that's something you have to look at. How do you pace it? When I talk about pacing, it's also about personnel. If you realize you need 3 or 4 people that you have to add to your program, can you bring all the 3 or 4 people in 1 year? You may not be able to. You may be able to bring in a GIS person the first year, then you may be bringing in a stormwater coordinator the second year, something you'll have to think through very meaningfully during that 5-year study period. And also, it's important to look for other efficiencies to be gained, other personnel that you may have in other departments that you can share to enhance your stormwater management activities, and then share the cost of those personnel within your organization. Same thing for equipment and other kind of material resources. You could have the same thing. If it is a fleet, if it is equipment, can we share that equipment if it can achieve multiple purposes? How do you then share the cost? And can we share it through some kind of an indirect cost allocation or a direct cost sharing purpose? Okay, so these are important decisions that you have to make from a policy perspective on program costs. Next slide. Okay, so now having made those decisions, now let's say we have now reached a point where we do have the revenue, we have a good understanding of what our annual revenue requirements are. We have done some iterations, so we have some good sense of what the annual revenue requirements are. How do we then recover that revenue requirement through a dedicated user fee funding? What should be the fee basis? Many of you would have heard very often in the industry when we talk about stormwater user fee program about impervious area. So impervious area is a very increasingly prevalent basis for defining stormwater charges. Because why? Because impervious area really prevents infiltration of stormwater runoff. So it's a reasonable good surrogate. Nothing we call is perfect. It's a reasonable good surrogate for estimating the runoff that a property contributes to the system and to the surface waters when we say system. And so that is why impervious area is increasingly a prevalent approach for defining stormwater user charge, because it gives some level of fairness and equity in charging the user charge. The second reason
in dem Fach.
Hope people can mute their audio. Thank you. So the impervious area, so that is one reason. The second reason also is that, we're really talking about it's not only about just generating money. And I think Elizabeth also talked about it last time. We both kind of emphasized this. This is not starting with how much money can I generate. This is about what am I giving to the community? Am I doing it in an equitable and fair manner so that properties that contribute more runoff pay their appropriate share? Properties that contribute less runoff, they pay their appropriate share. So equity is also an important consideration, whether you're a combined sewer community or whether you're a separate storm sewer community. So what we find in Black & Veatch, we do survey every 2 years, a comprehensive national survey of only utilities that already have a user fee program. So this is a survey where we send the survey to utilities and they actually respond. This is not like a website-based survey. And what we find is that we are finding a trend that in 2016 and in 2014, before that, when we did, there were fewer participants that would say they use impervious area. And now you can see in 2018, when we did, it almost went to 92% of the participants saying their charge is based on impervious area. And then 2020 looks slightly lower. It's not that it is changing. It is just that the participants are not always exactly the same. So we have some differences. But by and large, you see more than 90% of the participants usually say they use some form of impervious area to establish their charge. Next slide. So here, how do we then decide what should we use impervious area? How do we decide that that's really the way we want to go? Really, it starts with, can you get reliable data? Can you get reliable data, especially when you're trying to start a program new? Can you get that reliable data without spending extraordinary amount of cost and money for that impervious area data capture? Now, utilities this is where utilities will make decisions that are more pertinent to their environment. Some would say, look, let's leverage whatever data that is available in tax assessment systems. If there are building footprint and other good information, reliable data in tax assessment systems, can we leverage that? If there is already some impervious area data that was developed for some other reason, can we take that? So for example, in New Jersey, one of the things you will find is, there is impervious area data at a block level, But can you then use that data? It may be useful for a high level estimation, but if you really want to get it to a parcel level estimation, then you may want to decide whether you want to invest to really get to a parcel level impervious area data. So those are all important decisions that you have to make in terms of what's the level of effort that's going to be needed to really capture impervious area data. Am I going to do it one way just for the feasibility study so that I can see whether this is a viable funding for the community or not? And then once we know it is a viable funding mechanism, then I'm going to put in the resources to really do a more diligent impervious area capture that is billable quality. So those are all decisions that you have to kind of make when you're evaluating. And also ongoing data management. The capture is not just a one-time effort. One-time effort, yeah, for a good capture, but parcels change, the land use of the parcels change, the amount of impervious area could change because of development and redevelopment. So you also have to keep thinking about the methodology that we use, how is it going to lend itself in terms of ease of administration for data management. Lastly, but equally very important, especially in this day and age of technology, customers have expectations. If we say, hey, I just estimated it at a very high level based on something, they might say, with all the technology, can you not get to a better, reliable quality of parcel level data? So you have to balance all these things and then define how am I going to do the data capture? Am I going to use impervious area as a basis for establishing a charge? Next slide. Okay, so why is that important, that impervious area we talked about? Then that gives you the denominator. We talked about numerator, which is revenue requirements. Then we have a denominator that is going to tell you how am I going to recover the charge? That's where the impervious area plays a role. It not only plays a role, that then translates into the next step of defining a rate structure. So first thing, some of the decisions you will make during the process is, what should be my billing unit? Okay, let's say you made a decision that you want impervious area as the basis of charge. What should be the billing unit? Very often you would have heard the term equivalent residential unit. Some utilities will call it equivalent stormwater unit. But typically, okay, what is that? It is basically taking the median single family residential impervious area, determining in your community what is the median single family residential impervious area, and defining that median as one billing unit. So in one community, in a highly urban small community, for example, like Wilmington and Delaware, the median is something around only 800 square feet. In Philadelphia, it goes up to almost 1,200, 1,100 square feet. In some semi-urban kind of areas, it can go up to 1,500, 1,600, even 2,000 square feet. I've even seen 3,200 square feet being the median of single family residential impervious area, depending on the community and the demographics and really the land characteristics. So that is one way. The other way many utilities would consider is, okay, this equivalent residential unit, it seems a little bit not directly intuitive. It may sound a little complicated to some people. Can we just simply establish a simple basis? Yes, you can. You literally can say every 500 square feet of impervious area is one billing unit. So you could define it that way so that you don't have to worry about what the single family residential median or average is. So these are all decisions that you have to make as to which way you want to decide the billing unit. Then that translates into the next part, which is the rate structure. There are also decisions you have to make. There is, again, no right or wrong approach, but in the case of rate structure, it's all about equity. So if you decide, okay, I know how much I want to, based on impervious area, I know I have to collect out of $4 million per year. I know from the impervious area analysis I've done, even at a high level, I need to collect, let's say, $2 million from residential and $2 million from non-residential properties. Then the question is, how do you collect that $2 million from residential? Some utilities might say, I'm going to have a flat charge per parcel. Regardless of the amount of impervious area in a parcel, I'm going to just have a flat charge for every parcel. Every residential parcel will pay the same flat charge. Now, what are the pros and cons? Administratively, it is very simple. You don't have to worry about impervious area accuracy because every residential parcel is paying the same flat charge. But you also have to look at, is it equitable? Somebody who has 800 square feet of impervious area will be paying the same as somebody who has 3,000 square feet of impervious area. Now, in some communities, that may be meaningful because you're a highly dense environment with significant apartment kind of style of homes. It may be okay. But in some places where there's a real distribution of impervious area, you have to think whether that is meaningful from an equity standpoint. So in those cases, utilities may then think about another alternative, which is what we call a tiered impervious area, where you take all the residential impervious area, every property's impervious area, you still have to calculate for every residential property, but then you put them into tiers, and then you decide what the billing units are for the tiers, and then what the charge is based on that billing unit. That's what that little table is showing. There are also utilities, but not very common, but there are also utilities that say, you know what, we have good data, we are going to just calculate residential charge on an individual basis for every parcel. We are not going to charge them on flat charge or a tiered charge. We're going to simply calculate it for each parcel based on parcel specific impervious area. That is also totally acceptable. It gives more equity. Non-residential, typically speaking, non-residential, because it's very diverse, the amount of impervious area on properties. You could have a small salon, a small bakery. You could have a very large Home Depot, Walmart, right? Or even a huge speedway. You have all kinds of properties in a community. So typically, non-residential utilities consider calculating on an individual basis so that you really have much better equity. But that also means you have to have good level of data, and administratively you have to keep up the data when parcels change. There are very few we've seen that also decide to have a tiered charge even for non-residential. But in that case, you may have to, 4 or 5 tiers won't work. You may have to have a lot more tiers. So these are all things, again, we are not doing a deeper dive, but we just want you to understand what these things mean. And these things are also important considerations as you go through this journey of establishing user fee program. Next slide. So billings, the next part, okay, now we've talked about the revenue requirements, we've talked about some of the policies we will discuss and the rate structure, and we've come to some consensus on defining how the rate structure would look like. How do you bill it? Now that's most, especially for utilities, really utilities in New Jersey that don't have a stormwater user fee yet. How do you bill? What should we consider? There are different options. You could consider a standalone billing system, not very prevalent, to issue the bill. There are pros and cons to it. Because if you issue a standalone charge, first of all, the customer is going to get a bill. They may not even perceive that as a user charge. They may perceive that as a tax. So that, and how do you then collect on it? If they don't pay, how do you enforce? There are issues like that. Very often what we find is in our surveys, we find either utilities are billing through the county tax billing system, or they bill through the utility billing system, through a water sewer utility billing system. Both have a lot of pros and cons. Those are some things, again, you have to look through. In a utility billing system, the utility billing systems are by and large designed for billing using water meters, right? Water charges and water meters. So many a time readily they may not have parcels aligned with the water meters, what we call parcel ID. So those are all things you have to look at. How do you establish that relationship between a parcel ID and the utility account? Does it already exist? If it doesn't exist, you have to create that cross-reference. Only then you can bill through a utility billing system, and that cross-reference has to be maintained. So those are all things. Generally speaking, that's a fairly robust and complex way of billing. One of the relatively less complex way of billing is that if there's a good understanding with the county tax assessor's office, you could bill it through the county tax assessment system. Some utilities, and especially utilities in Florida, do that, billing through a county tax assessment system and going through that cycle and coordinating. It is still a user charge. Let's be very careful. It is still a user charge. It's not a tax. It's still a user charge, but they are billing it through a tax billing system because the tax billing system already has all the properties, parcel IDs and the owner name and all of that. And they have that mechanism to send the bills, collect the revenues, and then remit the revenues to the utility that is doing it. Okay, so that's another option. There are, again, cost implications to that. And when a county is providing that service, they may ask for some remittance charge. They may ask for some billing revenue, a certain portion of a fee for billing. All of that has to be worked out to be considered. So the sooner you think about these things, sooner you do the exploration in coordinating with a county or a water sewer utility that is there, you'll gather more information. You can start thinking about it so that you're not thinking of all of these as an afterthought later, because there are cost implications to these things. One is cost implications. Two, when you go for a public outreach, they're going to ask questions about these things. Then the next important aspect that will come up again is, do I bill the owner? Do I bill the tenant? This usually will come if you're going to try to bill through a utility billing system. Some utilities, they bill the tenants as well. Some utilities bill only the owners. It all depends on the policies that they have, and you have to then work through along with that. One of the other issues, it's not only about how you bill. The common question, can I exempt some property for X, Y, and Z reason? For political reasons, these questions come up. Again, these are all things that you have to evaluate. But one of the things we will tell you is that the moment you start giving exemptions, the program can start looking a little more arbitrary, because if the property is contributing stormwater runoff, and then you're going to start thinking, I'm going to give exemptions for this class of property or that type of property, there has to be a solid rationale. If without a solid rationale, if you're doing it only for political reasons, it can, to some extent, it can weaken the defensibility of the whole program. So something that you have to be very cognizant of. So that's really all we wanted to touch on. Next slide, please. So here are the considerations for billing systems. Again, if you're doing it one-time implementation, what is a one-time implementation effort and cost? You have to do some estimates based on coordinating with those entities. How is it going to be very easy to administer on an ongoing basis? Which approach is going to make it a little bit easier for data management, billing through the utility billing system, or billing through the county tax system, or any other system? What are the revenue collection implications? If you do through the utility billing system, do I have better enforcement in terms of shut off and stuff like that, and I can collect revenue? Or if it is a tax billing system, they may have better enforcement mechanisms as well. So you have to look into those kinds of things. And also, what systems are available? In which system you have to do a lot more programming? Which system is easy to prime to bring in the stormwater charge? All of these are considerations. Sooner you start thinking about it during the feasibility, the better it is when you go into when you go into making a compelling case. And more important, when you go to public outreach, you'll have better information, because these questions will come up. Customers may say, how are you going to bill it? In which bill am I going to see? So at least you'll have some answers. Okay, next slide. So in summary, as you can see, this might sound like, oh my God, there's a lot of stuff. But what we are trying to help is that, yes, there is due diligence needed. This is not something you can just turn around and say, I'm going to do a stormwater feasibility study in 3 months, because you do need to do this. The better due diligence you do upfront, the better it is for you to make a compelling case, engage with your stakeholders, explain to them, and better you have in terms of the program cost planning. Always don't just take one option and say, okay, this is what we're going to go with. It's better to consider 2 or 3 alternatives, and then make some informed decisions, taking into consideration the alternatives, the cost, what are the customer implications, what's the administration implications. Lastly, it's always good to have a well-defined plan addressing one or more of these things, and ideally all of these factors that we have talked about, having some kind of a roadmap, having thought through this so that you can have good decisions that you're making along the way. Micah, with that, I'm going to kind of pause to open it up to questions.
So we can put questions in the chat, which some of you already